Hidden Truths, Broken Lies, written and read by Elton Gar. Professor Gabriel Roth looked across the small dim room and his 7 students. He could still send them all home. He hadn't technically broken the law yet, but every one of these young men and women deserved better than to be ignored by yet another teacher. He waited a few seconds and then said, "I'm going to give each of you one last chance to leave." They all looked around at each other, and then Susan, a wealthy young woman, who had been one of the first to agree to study with him, said, "None of us are leaving. We want to learn, to really learn." "Okay, I assume you've all had your general education implants," the professor said. There were plenty of problems with the knowledge implants. That was why he was willing to break the law to teach these students. But there were also advantages. That was why so many people went along with them. The biggest was that every one of his students would have the same basic knowledge. There were some nods from the other students, and he said, "Great, I want you to do your best to forget all of it. The first step to true knowledge is to admit our ignorance." There was some murmuring at that, and Gabriel understood. Most of these students thought they were here to gain some advantage over everyone else, and Gabe believed they would have an advantage. But just telling them about the biases and gaps in the knowledge that had been implanted into their brains wasn't going to be enough. In his experience, they needed to discover that on their own. "So we're starting over?" Susan said. "If only it were that easy. We have a lot of work to do before we can start over." For the first week of his classes, Professor Roth spent every day waiting to be arrested. On the second day, he walked down a busy street just as he had done hundreds of times before. It was a pleasant day. The streets were busy but organized. People moved together, no one pushing through or slowing the flow. It felt like society's rough edges had been smoothed away. Then he saw a protector robot and almost panicked. As it passed by, it nodded and said, "Greetings, Professor. I trust you're having a productive day." Gabe muttered a vague response, too afraid to speak clearly. He feared he might blurt out that he was running an underground classroom, that he was trying to create minds that would disrupt the perfect order of society. The robot just walked past. By the end of the week, Gabe had convinced himself that the greatest danger was over. None of the students had turned him in. They spent their time discussing philosophy, history, religion, subjects that, while taboo, weren't technically illegal. Almost every day he found another gap in their knowledge or a bias worse than ignorance. He couldn't remove the implanted information, but he could add context. Maybe they use it to challenge the lies. But unlearning was always harder than learning something correct the first time. Then, one Thursday, almost a month into his classes, Susan rushed in. She'd become a leader in the class, smart, articulate, always well put together, but today she was a mess. Her hair was out of place, no makeup, clothes that didn't match. Her eyes were red as she said, "I think I made a mistake." One of the other students glanced down the long, empty hallway, checking if anyone was following her. As she did, Gabe asked, "What did you do?" "My mother asked where I was going, and I told her I was going to class." "I'm sorry, I just forgot it was a secret for a minute." Gabe had known this would happen eventually. He didn't like having his students lie to their parents, but the fewer people who knew about his class, the safer it was for all of them. Instead of dwelling on it, he said, "Everyone go home. Don't do anything to draw attention. Susan, you'll stay here with me." In seconds, everyone was gone. Being a student was less illegal than teaching, but they'd still get knowledge implants to counteract what they had learned. The standard implants were biased, but the supplementary ones were nothing more than propaganda. Susan stood there awkwardly for a few minutes and then asked, "What are we doing?" "If your parents turned you in, then the robots already know who you are. If they didn't, nothing will happen. So we'll have class until they show up." Susan sat at one of the empty desks, and the professor sat across from her. She asked, "But won't they catch you?" "And I'll convince them that you were my only student. Maybe I can convince them we just started, so they won't punish you," the professor said. Susan nodded meekly, but there were tears in her eyes. Rather than letting her dwell on her mistake, he asked, "Would you care to go over what you have read about the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights Movement?" Susan swallowed. "I'm confused. The history I know says slavery was a minor part of our past. But your book says that the Civil War was about slavery. It's about states' rights. And aren't the real racists the ones who keep talking about racism?" That was one of the complicated problems with the knowledge implants. They weren't just designed to give you information, they were designed to steer you away from certain thoughts. The thoughts that the wealthy and powerful should give up any of their power was the most taboo, but any subject that might make society more equal was likely to be altered. He was about to explain how little sense that made when he heard the familiar whir of servo motors. A protector robot entered the building. The professor wanted to run, but that wouldn't help. The robot was just one of thousands in the city. Hiding was almost impossible. Once he was in the system, every robot, camera, phone, and half the other devices in the city would be tracking him. They wouldn't need to chase him down. They'd just wait until exhaustion or a mistake brought him down. So instead, he said, "This is your first lesson, and it was my idea. You were just curious, and you didn't like it. Do you understand?" Susan nodded, still looking exhausted. That wasn't likely to work. Knowledge implants weren't considered a punishment, so they didn't need proof. That was one of the ways their society had become a utopia. Almost no one had to go to prison when you could implant knowledge into their brain that made them not want to or need to commit those crimes. But if this was her first class, they might not feel the need to implant much. He, on the other hand, would get the book thrown at him. Not just the basic knowledge implants that he had avoided until now because he had an advanced degree, but supplemental knowledge as well. And while he wanted to convince himself that he wouldn't be fooled and controlled like so many others, he knew that wasn't how it worked. "Greetings, Susan Walsh. Please step aside," the robot said. Its voice the same pleasant tone as always, but the last name sent the professor reeling a bit. He had intentionally not learned the full names of his students. That way it would be impossible for him to turn them in. He had known her family was well above average wealth, but not that she was one of the elite families. If he had known that, he might have sent her away on the first day. At least she wouldn't be punished, he thought. Most of the laws didn't apply to people with as much power and money as the Walshes. In fact, they were often encouraged to study and learn. But he didn't have time to think about that, as the robot turned to him and said, "Professor Gabriel Roth, you are charged with corruption of a minor and teaching antisocial behavior and knowledge. How do you plead?" He glanced at Susan and realized that the knowledge implants likely didn't include anything about being arrested. Why would the government teach people how to make their jobs more difficult? But even as someone who had always had a fair amount of privilege, he had grown up in a time when everyone knew you didn't talk to the police, and you certainly didn't plead innocent or guilty to them. The protector robot didn't wait for an answer. It simply reached out with a long metal arm and attached a device to the professor's wrist. Then there was a small, sharp jab. A few seconds later, and the professor was asleep. He woke up not in an interrogation room or a prison cell. Those barely existed anymore. Instead, he found himself in what seemed like the private study of somebody wealthy. He tried to turn his head, but something was attached, and his wrists were bound to the metal chair. It was one of the memory implant machines, and he began to search his mind for any new knowledge. From what he knew, the new knowledge should feel natural, but also be easier to access. Yet he found nothing. With nothing else to do, he scanned the books on the walls. The room was filled with classics, old and expensive editions. While he didn't see any of the officially banned books, that was mostly because they didn't need to ban books the way they once had. They simply included all the classics in the standard implants. But, from his discussions with people who had the standard implants, the versions were edited to cut out the most subversive meanings. "Do you like my library, Professor?" a woman said. She was taller than the average woman, with a hint of gray in her hair bun and glasses. Those were the first glasses Gabe had seen in years. They were reading glasses, of course. It was far too easy to repair an eye for anyone to wear them for any other reason. Even reading glasses were most likely an affectation. "I'm sure I could spend half a lifetime in this room, but tell me, are these real versions or ones edited for public consumption?" Gabe had always wanted to ask questions like that, but over the years it had become less safe to question anything about the government. But now that he had been caught, what did he have to lose? They were almost all first printings. A couple of decades ago, that would have cost me a small fortune, but nobody cares about them anymore. So the biggest expense is finding them, the woman said. "But do you read them?" the professor asked. "Then you don't know me. I'm Professor Bell, but you can call me Margo." He hadn't expected it to go this high. Professor Bell was one of the top scholars in the country. Not as high-ranked as the average person who had inherited billions, but when it came to education and re-education, there were only a handful of people more powerful than her, and none of them were scholars. "What do you want, Professor Bell?" "Okay, let's keep it formal then. I want you to work with me. A few small concessions and we can set you up with your own research and development team. You'd be helping to create the next generation of implanted education. A chance to shape the minds of billions of students instead of just a handful," Professor Bell said. "Sure, shape them into the form you want," Gabe said. "And why not? It's the new industrial revolution. Education, mass-produced so that any piece can replace any other, and we eliminate the friction and the frustration of the past while we're at it. I understand it's still new, and there are always Luddites, those who are afraid of advancement. But it's better this way. No more revolutions or wars. We don't even have hunger anymore. We also don't have people anymore. Not the way we used to," the professor said. "Which is why I don't want to have to start implanting things into your mind. You know the world's always been filled with people living lives of quiet desperation. The only difference is that we found a way to make those people useful, and I believe they are happier for it." "I won't join you," the professor said. "I expected as much. Some people have always been bad at looking out for themselves. I'll be back in 15 minutes. As she stepped out of the room, the professor felt the first of hundreds of tiny prickly sparks against his head. They weren't painful, or even uncomfortable, but he winced at each of them, and he understood that they were part of the implanting process. Even that wasn't as painful as he'd expected, and he began to understand. The world was filled with two different types of people. The smart, the wealthy, and the powerful were on one side, and the poor, lazy, and ignorant were on the other. But there was no wall, no forced gap. Anyone who was willing to work hard enough could become one of the elite. It was just that most people never put in the right type of effort. It all seemed so obvious. It was like the many times when he had read a book, and something he had never quite understood came into focus, and the world was just a bit clearer. A few minutes later, Margo came into the room. She smiled at him and said, "I trust you are willing to be more cooperative now?" "Of course," Gabriel said, looking at her with a more critical eye than before. This is the type of person he had often seen when he was working in academia, the type that was far better at the politics of education than learning. "Then all we need is a list of your students' names so that we can help undo any damage you may have done. Some of them might even be able to work with you if you want." Professor Ross considered it for a moment, and then said, "I'm happy to work with Susan, of course, and I understand the desire to get more names. It would make you look good. But she really was my only student." Margo looked at Gabe for a moment, and then said, "That's what Susan said as well. But I had to verify it." Gabe smiled at her, knowing that she believed she had him under her full control. There were hundreds of small ways that the information shoved into his brain suggested that she was his superior, and in some deep way he believed them. But he also believed that those who rose to power deserved it, and he was going to be one of them. But the only way that would happen was if they didn't know the full extent of what he had done. So, he needed to keep them hidden, and hope he had been wrong about the waves of humanity demanding their freedom. But there was something else, too. Sure, he might be able to rise to power to adjust the implants to serve his needs, but it was also possible that the things he had taught the others would work, that his students would learn to think for themselves, and if they somehow managed to get the unwashed masses on their side, well, staying on their good side would be useful too. Author's note. I spent a lot of my formative years being lied to. Many of the people who told me those lies believed them, and I suspect just as many didn't, though I can't know that. What I do know is that those lies did damage, and not just to me. They changed the way I saw and treated people. This story is built around my struggle to overcome that and how insidious those lies can be. Even though I know what I heard listening to talk radio 3 hours a day was wrong, I still have to make an effort not to let those ideas influence how I see the world, and I don't always succeed. It took years to work through those lies, and I was lucky to have help. But this story is also about the opposite, too. The people who have fallen down the rabbit hole. The people I respected who have said things that make me cringe, not just because I've changed, but because they've retreated into their echo chambers. I wish there was an easy solution, but all I know is that the marketplace of ideas is important. We need to keep talking about ideas. And even more importantly, we have to listen. That is how we find the best ideas, rather than simply trying to force everyone to agree with us. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you want to continue engaging with my thoughts and ideas about the world, you can sign up for my free weekly newsletter at sci-fi.com. There, you'll get access to more of my thoughts and free stories every week. If you can afford it and want to help me keep all of this going, and improve my audio setup, you can visit my Patreon at www.patreon.com/Elton. Free members get access to stories every week and can vote on the monthly theme polls. Paid members get access to over 40 patron-exclusive stories and can vote every week on what I write next. Thank you, Elton Gar.